Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Page, hosted by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, where we discuss issues shaping our world through works of fiction and nonfiction. My name is Brittany McGee, and today's version of Beyond the Page is on America Second, how America's elites are making China stronger. We're delighted to be joined by Isaac Stonefish, author of America Second, and eager to learn a little bit about your book. Welcome, Isaac.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So glad you could join us. So, America Second is a pretty provocative title. I'm curious why you wrote this book and why you wrote this book right now.
So I lived in Beijing for about 6 years, and when I got back to the States, one of the things that was most striking to me was to hear Americans, especially prominent Americans, talk about China not the way that other Chinese people would talk about China, which was quite varied, but to use a lot of phrases that the party elite would use. China has 5,000 years of history. China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. China only wants peace. And the issue with these phrases is not their veracity, except the last one, but the fact of repeating Chinese propaganda. And so later on, I would compare the phrases to saying all lives matter. So today, if you say all lives matter, you're making a very controversial political statement. The idea is not that all lives matter, all lives don't matter, but you're repeating a Republican talking point. 15 years ago, if you had said that, wouldn't really have mattered. People just thought you were a humanist. Now you're pushing back against Black Lives Matter. The same thing is with the phrase, China has 5,000 years of history. It doesn't matter nearly as much if it's true. It matters that you're repeating Communist Party propaganda and that you're implying that the Communist Party is the apogee of 5,000 years of history, and that finally China has developed to the point where they get to be ruled by the Communist Party. So listening to Americans talk about China, because when you're young and you come back, people always say, how's China? And then they'll answer the question for you. So there's a lot of listening that I did, especially as a journalist. When you talk to people who are important, they will share their opinions on these things. And so I was just very struck by the discourse that they had.
So in the book, you talk about major players in the U.S., many of them that are quite well known, from Henry Kissinger to the Disney Corporation to Marriott Hotels, and even to former Chicago Mayor Richard Daley. So these individuals, and sometimes huge global entities, you say are pretty complicit, perhaps knowingly or perhaps unknowingly, in pushing propaganda and in really creating this sort of discourse that China is looking to push forward. Can you talk a little bit about what these corporations and elites are doing and how they're carrying this influence within the U.S.?
Definitely. So first, a caveat. When I came back to the States, I moved to D.C., and so it was from the China world to this D.C. policy world. I run a consulting company. Part of what I say is because I have clients who change the way that I think about issues. I'm not an independent voice. I have affiliations with organizations, and that changes the way that I talk and think about things. My great frustration being in DC was that there was this idea that the policy elite had such sophisticated understandings of the world that they could perfectly compartmentalize something, that someone could pay Madeleine Albright tens of millions of dollars and it wouldn't change the way that she would speak about certain issues. So I don't know if I mentioned this in the book, but it's one of my favorite examples. Madeleine Albright wrote a book on fascism, great subject for a book, talked about how Egypt might be fascist, great. Turkey, Russia might be fascist, great. America under Trump also might be fascist, great. Controversial, but okay. North Korea, fascist, great. China, developing very rapidly, 5,000 years of history. Albright ran a consulting company called Albright Stonebridge. They're now owned by Dentons, which is a majority Chinese-owned law firm, which has an office in Urumqi, which is the capital of Xinjiang, the region in northwest China where upwards of 1 million Muslims are in concentration camps, and Lhasa. There's not that much legal work that you need to do in Lhasa unless you're working very closely with the Communist Party. So Albright, Disney, Kissinger, Scowcroft. It's very bipartisan. It runs very deep. I tried when writing this book, when you start Googling on Henry Kissinger in the internet, things get very conspiratorial very quickly. And like as another Jew, I'd recognize a lot of the sort of protocols of the Elders of Zion type motifs that you'd see when you start digging into Kissinger on this. So the idea is not that he's part of some sort of shadowy cabal that's secretly ruling the world. The idea is that Henry Kissinger, for the last 40 years, since starting his consulting company, Kissinger Associates, has been a business person masquerading as a diplomat. Kissinger's first job, and his first job for the last 4 decades, has been to make money. That's what business people do. But for so long, he pretended that he was just giving out this independent, objective policy advice from the school of realpolitik, as opposed to strengthening the Chinese Communist Party.
So aside from Henry Kissinger, who's the most egregious player in this? Like, if you had to name the main actor here.
So my top 3 would probably be Henry Kissinger, and then Henry Kissinger. He is so far beyond what anyone else does in this space, and he does have the ego to match. I think he would take a perverse pleasure in knowing that he was the most egregious for issues like this.
This is a compliment for Henry Kissinger.
In a way, in a complicated way. He's been doing it for so long. He has the highest level ties to every generation of Chinese leadership, since Mao. He's the most influential statesperson in probably, I don't know of US history, but certainly in the 20th century. And he has such deep ties to both the foreign policy elite and foreign policy journalists. And I remember, I don't think I put this in the book, but I talked to a prominent foreign policy commentator who wrote an article that was critical of Henry Kissinger. So I asked him about it, asked him about the experience, asked him about what Kissinger did. He was all very generous with his answers. And I said, great, can I use this in the book? And he said, no, I just started getting invited back to dinners. And it's just so amazing how powerful that is. At the same time, so I don't pretend to be a saint here, there is also a lot of power in going after big people that other people are not going after. And I think Kissinger, for so long, in some also very perverse way, his horrible legacy with Cambodia and Laos and Pakistan and Bangladesh defended him against this, because people who were anti-Kissinger were so caught up with what he did while he was in office that they really just let slide what he's done since 1982.
So most Americans will never meet Henry Kissinger, but they perhaps have a subscription to Disney Plus, or they attended NYU, or they're on Tinder, or they have gone to AMC theaters. So there is a sort of closeness to most Americans with the subject matter. I'm wondering what you would advise your average American. How should they think about the brands that they follow, the products that they consume, the institutions that they love, and quite frankly, that they donate to, as they are very much engaged in what you describe as a sort of subversion of some of the values, free speech, certainly liberty, that many Americans believe confidently that they stand for. How should they think differently about the average companies that they are close to?
I think the idea is to be very conscious about where you draw the line. What is something that is too much for you? And I think we've all had moments. So for me, in the China space, I'll mention again the Jewish part of it, because Xinjiang was the line for me. I think a lot of the issues that I discuss in the book, I chose to overlook for so much of my career. And then, I was raised on such a steady diet of never again. And then Beijing started putting Muslims in concentration camps, and that was the line for me. So similarly with Walt Disney, one of the reasons I spend so much time on them, at the end of Mulan, they thank public security bureaus in Xinjiang, in this region. And you just think, how is this appropriate? In what world are you expressing gratitude to a party organization that's complicit in crimes against humanity? And when you start pulling back the layers and look, you can just see these trends from the 90s to the 2000s to the 2010s of deeply entwining their corporate interests with the Communist Party. And so what I'd say as a consumer, it's what is too much for you? if you don't invest in military companies, then probably shouldn't have a Lenovo laptop. If for you, you're really against smoking, make sure that the companies that you invest in or work with aren't complicit in that in China. And for those who are very interested in human rights concerns at home, really do understand that your vote, your voice is really important on how to change this tide about how U.S. corporations act in China, because like Brittany was saying, it really does come home to here.
So some of the potential solutions to this you outlined towards the end of the book, and we won't reveal some of the conclusions, but I wonder if you think, not to put you in the prediction business, but do you think in 10 years this book will have proved to continue to bear out, and the practices that many of these companies, CEOs of these companies, organizations and institutions are leveraging will still continue? Will we be in the same place? Will your book still be relevant?
So, book will always be relevant.
It's timeless classic.
Timeless. I'm glad you caveated it with the prediction business. And the great thing about being in the prediction business is no one remembers when you're wrong. So if I say something that turns out to be very prescient, you guys will say, oh yeah, I went to that talk and that guy really predicted the thing, and that if thing doesn't happen, you'll forget about it. So thank you for doing that. That said, my prediction in this space is that this is the pre-war period. So sorry to start it off so glibly. I do feel like it's quite likely that we will be in an actual hot war with China, whether it's over Taiwan or Japan or Mongolia or Philippines or Vietnam or India or even Pakistan. And that is going to be very, very dangerous for a lot of people, but it's also going to be very dangerous for a lot of Chinese people in China who worked for Apple or worked for McKinsey, or worked for Boeing, and are suddenly viewed in China as spies for American corporations. I think one of the things about writing a book, for those who have done it, you finish the book, 9 months passes, you hope nothing happens in the world, and then the book comes out. And since I finished the book, the world has gotten a lot more critical of Beijing, and the practice of decoupling has already happened. There's certain phrases or certain ideas that people say, oh, we're not doing this, but we clearly are. Decoupling is one of them. Both the US and China are in the process of decoupling from each other. Cold War is another one. People say we don't want another Cold War. We're fighting a Cold War with China. We're fighting a trade war. We're fighting a cyber war. It might turn into a kinetic war. It might turn into a proxy war. It hasn't really yet, but we're already there. Containing China is another one. U.S. diplomats regularly say we're not trying to contain China. We are. We're very actively trying to contain China and the Chinese Communist Party. So I think a lot's going to happen over the next couple of months and the next year. A war with Taiwan could certainly be one, but I do feel like there's a growing awareness in boardrooms that the risks of investing in China, both from a U.S. regulatory perspective and a Chinese perspective, are a lot higher than people think. So I think a lot of these changes and a lot of this awareness is here to stay.
Isaac, thank you so much for joining us and talking about your book, America Second. Great read. It was fascinating, and I think useful for all Americans to think about what's going on in our country and the influences of other powers on free speech, human rights, and liberty. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.